it is a ultimate political goal of Putin to destroy the NATO alliance. The Russians have constantly discussed within their own echelons of their academic circles, the senior Kremlin politics, their policy documents. They've made it very clear that the NATO alliance is anathema to them. And the NATO alliance, of course, it has vulnerabilities. We're currently unprepared, I think, to defend from a serious reconstituted Russian threat. I think NATO understands that and is working rapidly to reinforce itself, including its eastern flank. And we see the Russians setting up a lot of the chess pieces that would be necessary for it to prepare to conduct such an attack.
This is a conversation with George Barros. George leads the team at the Institute for the Study of War that is responsible for tracking and analyzing the war in Ukraine and making daily updates on what is going on the battlefield and on the strategic level. They are now the most quoted think tank in the world, and so there's a good chance that you have seen George's work before. In this conversation, we talk about the shape of the Russian military as it's getting ready for a major offensive against Ukraine. When will Russia run out of tanks, or whether Russia would and could attack NATO? And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Dominic.
So you're the lead on the Russia-Ukraine portfolio and the Institute for the Study of War, where your job is to track the progress of the war on a daily basis. Before we talk about how do you do that, and how do you track the war, I'd like to talk about what is your bread and butter, and that's what's happening with the war today. And if possible, I'd like for us to take a step back and start by asking, what is your most objective assessment of where do you think we are today? And what is your view on the situation on the ground in the Ukraine war? What does it look like? And how did it change in the recent weeks and months?
Sure. Before we talk about the situation on the ground, I think it's very helpful that we first situate where we are in terms of the various actors' objectives, strategic objectives, because that will help us give direction and assessment of what's going on the ground. We assess that the Kremlin's objectives for this war have not changed fundamentally from any point in time from where they were originally back in February 2022. Putin still seeks to conduct a war of conquest over Ukraine. He still seeks to conduct regime change. And he ultimately seeks to also, beyond the scope of the Ukraine war, defeat the NATO alliance. I don't think Putin's looking for an off-ramp to try to end the war anytime soon. I don't think that Putin would be satisfied with either the de facto lines of control that exist now or with simply capturing the 4 Ukrainian oblasts that Putin declared as annexed, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk. Putin just, late last fall said that Odessa was a Russian city. And so I think the Russians they have the intent to conduct a long war, to wait out the West and to conquer much, if not all, of Ukraine and conduct a regime change. The Ukrainians also seek their maximalist objectives of liberating all Ukrainian territory, repelling Russian forces from Ukraine, and continuing to exist as a sovereign state. I think that both of Kiev's and Moscow's positions are very far apart from each other. I think that there really isn't a basis for negotiations anytime now. And the reality of, regardless of what we read in the newspapers about Putin trying to angle for negotiations, Putin's actually spinning up the Russian defense industrial base, spinning up the Russian population, and setting conditions for a long, protracted war, as the Ukrainians are trying to sustain a long, protracted defense as well. So I think that's a strategic picture of the objectives. What's happening on the ground right now, of course, is the Russians are trying to exploit the disappointments from Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, with the Ukrainian forces having culminated months ago. And now they're trying to use the strategic initiative in Ukraine in order to make some military territorial gains. It's our assessment that the Russians have the initiative throughout the entire theater in Ukraine, arguably perhaps except for a small part of Kherson Oblast, where the Ukrainians are still maintaining some form of extended protracted presence on the left bank of the Dnipro River in Krinky. But aside from that, the Russians have the initiative across the theater. Right now, we assess that the Russians are preparing to begin, or perhaps maybe already have begun, a large winter offensive. We've collected a lot of indicators that suggest that it's still a question of where might that offensive exactly occur. My personal opinion is that it's probably going to occur in northeast Ukraine and Luhansk Oblast. But we see that the Russians are preparing for some sort of major effort. The Russians have been able to conduct some rotations in northeast Ukraine. We've seen the deployment of some additional forces to that area. We saw an increased use of Russian glide bombs attacking frontline positions in that area of the theater. And we also expect that we've also saw the Russians decrease their tempo of operations immediately following the new year, perhaps to rest in order to prepare for another major effort. There's sort of like three hypotheses on where the major attack could happen, and I can go into those if you're interested. The other factor that the Russians are waiting for, and this is the tactical timing factor, is optimization for when to do the attack based on weather conditions. Of course, fighting in Ukraine is bound by seasonality, and the physical hardness of the ground is tied to the temperature. Current weather forecasts show that the ground's going to get pretty hard. The weather's going to get really cold in late January, early February, which we're about close to. And of course, it's the exact time last year, late January, early February 2023, was when we saw a large Russian attack in Luhansk Oblast. And of course, back then also the large Russian attack on Vuhledar. So a lot of these indicators and patterns are all coming together in a forecast that we're probably going to have a large Russian offensive.
I think I'd love to hear about the locations and the details of the offensive, but maybe even before that, what is the shape of the two militaries before the offensive begins? Because we've heard that Ukraine military is now facing the reduced supplies of ammunition and military aid in general, but we've also heard that Russians, on the other hand, have been suffering from fairly heavy casualties from their offensive actions so far, and that they have also been perhaps facing some manpower shortages because they haven't, before the upcoming presidential elections in Russia, the Russian leadership is hesitant to declare further rounds of mobilization. So are the Russians able to conduct a large counteroffensive, or offensive maybe at this point? I don't know if we should, what's the correct naming for offensives and counteroffensives when it's a successive line of them? But are they able to launch a major offensive, and are the Ukrainians able to defend against it?
Sure. Before I answer the question, I'll just give a little disclaimer, which is, as a matter of policy, the Institute for the Study of War does not collect on any friendly forces or assess their operations or their readiness. So we don't actively collect on Ukrainian capabilities in that way. It's a known blind spot that we have, but we do it to respect Ukrainian operational security. We do the same, by the way, for our allies in Taiwan and our former allies in Afghanistan. We were studying that conflict more closely, our Iraqi partners, and so on and so forth. That said, we do have some insights I can share with you. Both forces are degraded. The Ukrainians, of course, expend most of their major offensive combat potential with offensive operations with the South, with the Southern counteroffensive last year. But they've since stopped that. They've now redeployed many of those brigades to go reinforce defensive efforts. Most famously, of course, is probably the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which was operating on the main effort in Zaporizhia Oblast near Robotyne and Verbove. That brigade's deployed to Avdiivka, and then that viral clip of the Bradleys shooting up that T-90 that happened in the Avdiivka area with some forces from the 47th Brigade. So they've been reinforcing and seemingly successfully defending that area so far. There's been no, I think, acute problem with the Ukrainians in terms of manpower that we've seen quite yet. they seem to be doing okay. For the short tactical duration, I think operationally and strategically, manpower is not the issue. The key issue for the Ukrainians, of course, is materiel. We know that the Ukrainians have had to ration their consumption of main field artillery, the 155 millimeter artillery. That's a huge constraint on what the Ukrainians can do defensively and defensively. You need all these systems for both offense and defense. And it's very difficult unless you have classified information or you really go out of your way to study the strengths of the individual brigades. But from what I can tell, it seems that the Ukrainians are probably in a decent position to continue defending right now, and they'll be okay in the short term, but they will not be okay if Western support is not there to continue supporting them or sustaining them. So I see them being okay for perhaps the next season. But beyond that, it's contingent on them continuing to receive material. I think material is the key rate determiner because, as you know, the Ukrainians have made a political decision not to recruit any of their military-aged men under the age of 27. And those men, for the most part, they still remain in Ukraine. And it's a strategic asset that the Ukrainians can mobilize and recruit if they need to. So really, the manpower is not the problem. It's the material. For the Russian side, the Russian military has come a long ways in reducing a lot of the acute manpower shortages that the Russian military faced. There's a lot of lessons that we have learned in following the war so far, and one of the key things is not to overlearn the old lessons and overcorrect. The Russians had some serious manpower problems in 2022. They began experiencing them acutely in May. And then, of course, we had Putin with his partial mobilization in September 2022. And then since then, he conducted a very technically elaborate, what we call it sort of like the crypto mobilization campaign, where they have a variety of different schemes to get bodies in boots and bodies to the front line, and also to create reserve regiments. That's been quite successful. The Russians now, they seem to be able to rejuvenate their units and bring them up to close to their desired end strength for the various different units. Perhaps not as high quality because the forces that are being recruited now haven't undergone the same kind of training as what they obviously had earlier. But still, nonetheless, getting up to those strength levels. And we've also seen that the Russians are able to conduct some operational level rotations. It's much easier for them to rotate units now and move them around and give guys rest. And that's a big deal. One of the most interesting indicators that we saw recently that talks about how the Russians have fixed some of their large-scale mobilization and force generation problems was actually a little breadcrumb that the Russian ambassador to the Central African Republic gave. He stated that currently Russia and the Central African Republic are in negotiations for establishing a new Russian military base in the Central African Republic, and reportedly the base that the Central African Republic officials want the Russians to move into can accommodate up to 10,000 soldiers. I don't know if the Russians are going to be able to deploy that many, but the fact that they're simply negotiating it is quite a worrying indicator, because we know that back in 2022, the Russians, they pulled and scraped together all the cats and dogs from all of its small bases deployed across the world. Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh. They pulled contractors from Kant Air Base in Kyrgyzstan. So they were really scraping the bottom of the barrel, and now apparently they're comfortable enough to discuss sending stuff out again, which is quite worrying. We also know that the Russian defense industrial base has recovered largely from the bump that it had in 2022. The Russians are currently producing the same level or slightly above the same level of precision-guided munitions that the Russians were producing prior to 2022. So they've been able to overcome the initial bump, the hump from the sanctions, and they're on track to substantially supersede the production levels from pre-2022 at the end of this year, 2024. The Russians also have managed to continue getting, armored vehicles out, refurbishing them, fixing them, sending them out to Ukraine, in part through leveraging partnerships. The Kyrgyz Republic reportedly is also helping the Russians refurbish armored vehicles and things of that nature. The Russians have been able to evade a lot of sanctions and use technology transfers and import substitution to try to help get around some of those sanctions. So the Russians have done a pretty good job of, I think, increasing their strength level, increasing their flexibility, and setting the conditions to waging really a protracted long war. With regards to the current offensive, will the Ukrainians be able to defend? I think it's a great question, and it comes down to how do the Russians decide to from operational art pursue their offensive? Will the Russians split up their forces among multiple different sectors and then spread themselves too thin and attack in multiple directions and not be particularly effective in one, or will they decisively accumulate into one area and try to go for a single operational level undertaking with a lot more resources behind it? I currently don't know. I would hope that Gerasimov would continue to make the kind of mistakes that he has throughout the course of his leadership as a theater commander in this war and split them up. But he might put them together. The Russians are, as you know, they're conducting offensive operations in the Avdiivka area. They're in Donetsk. They're conducting offensive operations in the northeast near Kupiansk and Kharkiv. They're conducting offensive operations also in the northeast in Luhansk. And do the Russians reinforce one of those decisively, or do they spread themselves out? That I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure. If they spread themselves out, I think the Ukrainians will have a decent shot at repelling it, or if necessary, exploiting defense in depth and trading a lot of Russian combat power at the expense of the loss of no strategically or operationally significant territory. That would be a good trade in Ukraine's case. But if the Russians decide to mass up, then they might be able to achieve maybe a moderate operational success. I think worst case scenario is if the Russians decide they want to go for Kupiansk and Kharkiv, which is an operationally significant city. That could cause some problems for the Ukrainians down the line because it helps the Russians get to better geography, helps them get past a river that's difficult to cross, and can open up some new courses of action for Kharkiv. But I'm skeptical that they're going to pick that option.
I want to follow up on a few things that you've mentioned, talking about the Russian military. And one of them is the issue of lessons learned. And I think there are sort of two schools of thoughts on this topic when it comes to the Russian military. And one says that Russians have been able to progressively learn from their mistake and improve their tactics, strategies as the war goes on. And the other one argues that it's not true and that they still keep making the same mistakes as they have in the first months of the war, and that their capacity to learn, unlike the Ukrainians, is hugely exaggerated. So I'd love to hear, where do you stand on that?
I think it's important to discuss at what level of war are they making mistakes and are they learning from their mistakes. I think at the strategic level of war, the Kremlin is improving. And the way in which they go about looking at the war, they've actually learned from a lot of their mistakes. It was very clear that the initial strategic assumptions for the war was easy. 3-day special military operation. Russia wouldn't have to declare mobilization. They could cannibalize all of their conventional units into the battalion tactical groups, break them out. Those are going to work fine. They're going to work on 4 axes, and they're going to be able to capture most of Ukraine within a month, right? That strategic calculus was deeply flawed. The Russians paid a steep price for it. And now I think the Kremlin has successfully, at the strategic level of the war, they understand that the center of gravity is attacking the Western coalition, their political will. They understand that they actually have to fight a long, protracted war. Last January, Defense Minister Shoigu announced a new plan for a major force restructuring of the Russian military. They're dissolving the Western Military District and reforming the Leningrad and Moscow military districts to give more command and control bandwidth that would focus on that northern flank of Ukraine, and then also one to bifurcate to look at the Finland and Baltics direction. That's an improvement. Shoigu also announced that the Russians seek to form at least 12 new maneuver divisions. That is orienting away from the 2000s reforms of the Russian military that saw the consolidation of the Russian military into brigades that, in principle, were supposed to be able to react swiftly and professionally to conflicts in Russia's periphery. The Russians realized that that concept in practice didn't work for them. They actually have to go back to the hulking large Red Army model, and so they're currently in a long-term restructuring to make the current Russian army look more like the old Soviet Red Army from the 80s. So that's a strategic level learning, and they're learning those lessons, and they're heading in that direction. Operational level of war, I think the Russians are getting better at it. The appointment of a theater commander was a big deal in ameliorating a lot of their operational level problems. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, unfortunately for the Russians, they continue to keep Gerasimov as the theater commander, and he's not, he's made a series of mistakes. There's a lot of ink that's been spilled about Gerasimov's problems, the fact that Putin values loyalty over competency, so on and so forth. And Gerasimov, I think, continues to execute and make some of those mistakes at the operational level. But they've made some operational level fixes nonetheless. The successful Russian defense from the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, that was a significant operational success for the Russians. So credit due where credit's owed. And it's not just Gerasimov. Gerasimov has, some competent subordinates. General Teplinsky, the commander of the airborne forces, he was able to successfully command the southern defense quite well. And he's a very highly regarded general within the Russian military. At the tactical level of war, it varies. Some Russian units, I think, and this is where it becomes important to attribute, who's commanding and what units are conducting what operations where, but it varies. General Teplinsky, the tactical defense of the southern Ukraine in 2023 was really good. The Russians conducted a doctrinally sound tactical defense, operational defense against the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The 58th Combined Arms Army that conducted that defense in Zaporizhia, they performed very well. The Russians were able to reinforce it with reserves from the 7th and 76th Airborne Divisions pulled from other parts of the theater while they were still in contact on the line, a very difficult thing to do. But they managed to pull that off, and it was done, I think, relatively professionally. Other Russian offensive efforts in the same time period were very sloppy. And I think those lead credence to the Russians have not learned some tactical lessons. If you look at Avdiivka and you look at the combat footage that first arose in early October 2023, when the Russians began their renewed assault there, you saw some really unprofessional stuff. I mean, we saw like the armored vehicles falling into the reservoir. We saw them bunched up in tight, column formation while moving into fighting positions. They presented themselves as very easy targets for Ukrainian defenders, and those tightly grouped armored formations were sort of like the maker's mark for Russian tactical incompetence that we saw demonstrated during the Battle of Kiev. And so when I looked at that combat footage, I thought to myself, okay, well, whoever's commanding this battalion or this brigade, they're clearly replicating the same mistakes that were conducted about 2 years ago on the in the outskirts of Kiev. So this person's not learned their lessons yet. So it varies, and that's important to know. So in short, strategic level, learned a lot of the mistakes and are actively correcting them, but it takes a long time to do so, and that's what's really scary and keeps me up at night. Will the West also make the correct strategic adjustments? Operational level, they made a lot of fixes, but Gerasimov's kind of incompetent, and they kept him there. But Gerasimov does have some competent subordinates who can actually conduct an operational success depending on where they are at. You can also have incompetent subordinates, and then tactical level, it varies. Some units are good, some units are bad.
I think one of the important reasons why this is one of the reasons why this is an important issue is that often the ability to learn and adapt throughout an ongoing conflict is often shown as one of the main advantages that NATO or the Western militaries have over our adversaries. So whether Russians are able to do that or not is quite an important factor. But I'd like to ask some on slightly different topic regarding the Russian military, and that's the issue of Russian losses, and specifically in this way, equipment losses, because we have been seeing that Russians have been losing throughout the offensive actions in the past, whether Avdiivka or in other theaters. They've been losing still very large quantities of equipment. And according to the sources of the Ukrainian military, the Russians have today to date lost over 6,000 tanks and over 11,000 armored vehicles. And one of the things that I keep wondering about is, are these figures accurate? And I think they probably roughly are. But if they are accurate, shouldn't the Russians be nearing a point when, for example, when it comes to tanks, they start running out of equipment they can put in action? And it seems to me like that should happen soon, but at the same time, it doesn't seem like the Russians would be reducing the number of the equipment that they are putting out there. And they have actually been losing even more equipment than, for example, in the first year of the war. So what is your view on the Russian losses as they're often reported in the media or on the Ukrainian information? And if they're correct, when will the Russian run out of tanks?
Yeah. Um, I'll say it's not possible for open source researchers or even researchers who have access to classified information to completely know what the battle damage to the Russian conventional military is. There are, of course, there are estimates. There's conservative estimates. There are the less conservative estimates. I don't know what they are, and the classified researchers don't know what they are. I don't think the Ukrainians know what they are fully, because in order to be able to correctly identify that, you actually have to control the battlefield at the end of the day and be able to walk around and count all the destroyed stuff and assess, oh, is this repairable or not repairable? And ultimately, when you're talking about manpower, you have to be there and count bodies. And even then, even when you do have complete control over a battlefield, you can't always count the bodies because sometimes there aren't any bodies left. World War II battlefield scholarship acknowledges that all the time. So nobody really knows. The Russian losses have been very heavy. Nonetheless, the Russians have taken a lot of steps to try to offset some of these acute problems that they would have with their materiel. Ural Vagonzavod, sort of the principal Russian tank manufacturing plant, they have some pretty aggressive targets that they're trying to hit in terms of monthly and annual production for output of tanks and other armored vehicles. And from what I've read in open source, they've managed to be able to successfully month over month increase their output. The Russians have been talking with the Belarusians about, setting up joint production for various different things, including Sukhoi 25 close air support vehicles. The Kyrgyz are helping the Russians with refurbishing armored vehicles. And so the Russians have managed to be able to diversify their defense industrial base and make it more of a coalition of states that are supporting the Russian warfare. It's not just Russia. And they've also worked really hard at retooling their entire economy to become closer to a full-time war economy to support this effort. The Russians, of course, have lots of vehicles and tanks that they have in long storage. I'm not able to assess how many of those are readily available for service or how quickly they can be refurbished to become serviceable. But I don't think that the strategic calculus for Ukraine or for the West should be predicated on sort of like the Russians are approaching a cliff where they're about to critically run out of stuff. And as long as we just wait, 3 more months or 6 more months, then the Russians will hit that cliff and we win by default. I don't think that's a very strategically sound way of thinking, because what we've seen is that the Russians they've come close to some really hairy moments. I think the hairiest moment was September 2022, following the Ukrainian rout of Russian forces in Kharkiv. That's when then Putin called his emergency mobilization. That was the most critical, vulnerable point that I think the Russians were at any point in time this year. Lost opportunities there for not reinforcing the Ukrainians at that time. But the Russians have been able to backfill. They've been able to surge. They've been able to diversify and spin up output. They've been able to find coalition partners, be it the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans. And that cooperation has allowed the Russians to continue conducting this war. And I think it will allow them to continue conducting this war in a long, protracted manner. So really the way to see this conflict, I think, is less so in the terms of the Russians are going to hit this decisive cliff and then we win by default if we're just patient enough. It's actually the operating assumption should be the Russians have constraints. They have limited resources, but we also have to keep the pressure on the Russians because otherwise they're going to find ways to be able to continue this, because their whole strategy is based on leveraging, I guess nominally against Ukraine, one-on-one, larger GDP, larger defense industrial base, larger population, larger natural and national resources to just bring down a lot of weight on Ukraine. If you think about it in terms of a war of a coalition, Iran, China, North Korea, Russia, Belarus versus the NATO alliance supporting Ukraine, then it's a lot more balanced. And actually, the NATO alliance dwarfs the access of dictators by a substantial amount if the NATO alliance actually decides that it's going to continue doing what it's doing and, where necessary, increase support so that the Ukrainians can actually win.
Well, let me ask you one follow-up question on this, because I think when we found out that Russia is now getting substantial amount of its ammunition and perhaps other military aid or supplies from North Korea, I think there were two different reactions to that. And one of them was that it's actually maybe good news because it's like, look at the Russians. They're so desperate that they now have to be buying stuff from North Koreans. And the other one was actually, that's not a good message because it means that regardless of the question of prestige, Russians are able to acquire what they need from other places if they're not able to manufacture it themselves. So I assume that you would be more in the second camp on this.
Yes. I would agree. The sanctions regimes have not been sufficiently tight. I mean, the Yermak McFall working group on studying sanctions, they've released a report recently, which was really good, that showed about, how the Russians, they're able to use proxies in other states in order to procure a variety of necessary equipment and technologies necessary for waging a war and sustaining an economy and all that good stuff. As long as the Russians have the access to all of these different partners, it substantially increases their operational capabilities. The Iranians in particular have done a very good service for the Russians in helping the Russians be able to maintain constant airstrikes against Ukraine, air and missile and drone strikes against Ukraine, and also help the Russians learn about how to best overcome Ukrainian air defenses. No, the Russians have a limited number of precision-guided munitions, with their various different cruise missiles. But the Russians have been tinkering and experimenting with using modified strike packages where they use different proportions of the Shahed drones and different numbers and types of Russian missiles and ballistic missiles in order to figure out what combination works the best for defeating Ukraine's air defenses, particularly around Kiev and other big cities. And the Iranians, of course, through a technology transfer, they've established a new big factory for producing Shahed drones, but in Russia itself. And that, of course, has granted the Russians a whole new operational capability of being able to execute more frequent and more effective strike packages targeting Ukraine. These partnerships, they're going to help make the Russian war effort more sustainable in the long run. And again, Russia's current problem that it has with these acute shortages in the short term, they're not going to be as acute in the long term as the Russians further further mobilize their defense industrial base, as they further mobilize their economy, as they work out a lot of these kinks, as they transition to full-time wartime production. Um, so with all the problems that we've identified, the Russians are working to try to solve them, and they're going to stabilize over time.
And how's our capacity, meaning NATO's or the capacity of United States and of Europe and the UK? Because we hear a lot that um, Europe, mainly Europe, is very slow in delivering and ramping up its defense production. But at the same time, it looks like we're also moving ahead, albeit at a much slower pace than it would be desirable.
Yeah. The war in Ukraine has shown that Europe and also the United States, we are vastly unprepared for sustaining a major conflict with a peer adversary, for a conventional shooting war. Um, it's very good that we learned this lesson with Russia and Ukraine, as opposed to the more terrible version of this lesson, which would have been, a war with China in the Pacific. Um, but the fact of the matter is that the European and American defense manufacturing, defense industrial base, it's atrophied over the last three decades or so, and it's not prepared to meet the challenges of the intensity of modern peer adversaries in modern conflicts. So it's good that we're working together now to try to expedite it and accelerate it. Unfortunately, it's taken as long as it has. We're now heading into the third year of this war, and frankly, it's kind of shocking that it took this long for the Europeans to start getting more serious about European defense and manufacturing. But I'm very glad that they're doing it now. Better late than never. However, there's been warnings, and the writing's been on the wall for a long time for, frankly, Russia's intent to eventually defeat the NATO alliance, to conquer Ukraine, to bully its neighbors. And when the war started in February 2022, that would have been the prime time for the European Defense Industrial Base to kick into high drive and start doing some of the corrective, the reinvestment into its own industry that we're starting to see now. But I think what we see now is prompted largely to the fact that the war in Ukraine has tapped most of the European stockpiles, and greatly reduced the American stockpiles. The South Koreans were really what enabled Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023, with the ammunition that the South Koreans provided. So this investment is all very necessary, and I'm glad that we learned a lesson. But the common theme is the West has this problem, which is we tend to learn the lesson too late. So hopefully, as long as we can get ahead of that decision curve and come away with the necessary conclusions sooner and faster, that will give us an edge and help us enable the Ukrainians to defend their country.
On the issue of the industrial capacities, I think there's one thing that has been quite visible recently, and that's the Ukrainian capacity to strike Russia's either defense capacities, defense industrial capacities, or oil manufacturing capacities, and to do that deep behind Russian lines. We've seen a major example with a Ukrainian drone that was able to strike and cause a lot of damage in a oil processing facility near St. Petersburg. And I wonder if, because these are news that always get quite a lot of attention, but I wonder to what extent do you think they have a strategic importance, or if they're more news that feel good but probably wouldn't do much on the grand scale of things?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important that the Ukrainians be able to strike legitimate military targets within Russia itself, because the Russians, they leverage all of this infrastructure, they leverage these facilities, they leverage dual use facilities and technologies to conduct their war in Ukraine. And the fact of the matter is that the Russians, if you treat everything that is within the territory of Russia as a sanctuary space, then it gives the Russians a tremendous amount of flexibility for being able to amass power right up close to where the Ukrainians can't do anything about it, and then project that power into Ukraine. Conversely, if you disrupt the logistics, if you disrupt the assembly areas, if you disrupt the supply lines and key infrastructure, you make it much harder for the Russians to be able to sustain their war effort within Ukraine. Um, it'll be a natural phenomenon that if the Ukrainians continue to reclaim more territory in the long run, and as the battle space compresses, just look at a map of where we were in spring 2022 versus where we are now. As the battle space and the territory of what Russia occupies compresses, the former deep rear goes further into Russia / is in Russia than what it used to be. The Ukrainians in their southern counteroffensive for Kherson Oblast in 2022, they enabled their ability to maneuver into Kherson precisely by striking Russian forces with the HIMARS system that were then in the rear areas that the Ukrainians could not previously strike. So they didn't have a capacity to go that far and go that long. And because the Ukrainians were able to degrade the forces, strike stuff, including infrastructure, that enabled the Ukrainians to progress. Doing the same now within Russia, it makes a lot of sense, and it does have substantial cumulative effects if they're not one-off rare events that the Russians can triage and react to and sort of patch the problems in a short period of time. Ideally, the Ukrainians will conduct sustained, persistent attacks against these critical infrastructure in order to actually not just sort of inflict temporary damage, but degrade capabilities. And I think the Ukrainians seek to do that. They've been working for over a year now on a special indigenous drone that has a range of 1,000 kilometers and a payload, I think, of 75 kilograms. And they seek to, I think, produce 1,000 of these drones this year in 2024. And I see that as the Ukrainians developing their own ability to conduct deep strikes into Russia. And that's a capability that the Ukrainians need, and that they should be able to do, and that, frankly, they've not been able to do because a lot of the Western aid and the Western provided weapon systems, they come with strings attached, which include you can't strike Russia proper, but you can strike occupied Ukraine, which is one of the constraints and one of the ways that I think not optimal Western aid has tied the Ukrainians behind their own backs, tied an arm behind their backs. The Ukrainians are also working on developing other kinds of long-range strike systems that they seek to be able to use against the Russians. So this is quite important.
So I'd like to move to the part where I would like to learn about what you actually do at the ISW. But before we do that, I would have one more question. And that's on the topic that's been, I think, getting quite a lot more attention recently. And that's the issue of a potential escalation of the war in Ukraine further, and a potential possibility of Russia attacking NATO, or specifically the Baltics. And we've seen a number of statements coming from officials in NATO countries and reports from various institutions and experts that have been quite explicitly warning about this. And I would say that the experts that I've talked to have very different opinions on this. And I'd love to hear what you think. And what do you think is, A, whether Russia would have the military capacity to try to do anything like that, or do anything like that successfully, and whether you see this as something that would be in line with Russian strategic goals.
Yeah. I don't outlaw at all the possibility of Russia one day attacking the NATO alliance in its weak flank, which is the Suwalki corridor between Poland and Lithuania. The Russians, in our assessment, don't have the capability to do that anytime in the near future, and we've not collected any indicators that suggest that the Russians are preparing for an attack on the Baltic states. Um, and they probably won't have the capability for the next several years. But if the Russians are able to substantially increase their military power, if they're able to reconstitute and rebuild, if they're able to re-equip, as a lot of their current force generation and defense industrial base mobilization efforts are seeking to achieve, then I would not be surprised if in 3 to 5 years, the Russian military posture and Russian military threat and their capability to actually conduct some kind of hybrid war against one of the Baltic states would substantially increase. I think we understand from Putin's strategy that it is a ultimate political goal of Putin to destroy the NATO alliance. Um, the Russians have constantly discussed within their own echelons of their academic circles, the senior Kremlin politics, their policy documents. They've made it very clear that the NATO alliance is anathema to them. Part of their demands for the United States and the NATO alliance in 2022, or pardon me, late 2021, early 2022, before the official announcement of the special military operation, was, of course, essentially NATO rolling back to its 1994 borders, which notably does not include Poland and the Baltic states and much of the states in the Balkans that are now in NATO. So it is a part of formal Russian demands. I think it is part of Putin's ultimate geopolitical goals and political objectives. And the NATO alliance, of course, it has vulnerabilities. We're currently unprepared, I think, to defend from a serious reconstituted Russian threat. I think NATO understands that and is working rapidly to reinforce itself, including its eastern flank. And we see the Russians setting up a lot of the chess pieces that would be necessary for it to prepare to conduct such an attack in the long run. We see the Russians constantly, and in the last 2 months particularly, intensify its information operations against the Baltic states about their supposed mistreatment of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers living there. That, of course, was the core justification for Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, the core justification for Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then also more recently in 2022. And I'll note that in the case of both Georgia and Ukraine, those information operations did not begin in 2008 or in 2014. Those were information operations that began in the 2000s that the Kremlin supported for many years before then intensifying it and then capitalizing on it later. The Russians have done a tremendous job in the last 3 years of substantially increasing their control over Belarus and obtaining permanent military basing in Belarus, right on the border with Poland and Lithuania, and gaining unprecedented freedom of maneuver for Russian forces in Belarus. Previous NATO wargaming and thinking saw Belarus as Russian aligned, but it's kind of a wild card. Do the Belarusians give the Russians freedom of movement and maneuver? Because historically, the Belarusians had denied that. Lukashenko, up until 2020, had always been against establishing a permanent Russian military base, combat forces military base in Belarus. He explicitly denied the creation of an air base in 2015, and the Russian military has since 2020, they've established a permanent Air Force presence in Belarus. They've reportedly gained a permanent air base in southwestern Belarus, in Gomel Oblast. The Russians have maintained forces constantly within Belarus since late 2021. And now it seems that if you look at just the map of the Soliki corridor between the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad and Belarus, the key assumption for all the most dangerous course of actions is they isolate the Baltic states and they deter any NATO action. That play, given what the Russians have in Belarus now, looks a lot more feasible in the long term, especially if the Russians decide to, let's say, permanently deploy one of the newly being reformed 12 divisions. If they deploy one of those permanently in Belarus, that will also be a big major red flag. And of course, here's the other thing that I think I'd also add to this whole scenario. Putin doesn't have to completely conquer or occupy a Baltic state. All he simply has to do is conduct a military operation and undermine the territorial integrity of one of the Baltic states and successfully deter any NATO intervention or retaliation. And that will effectively destroy the credibility of the NATO alliance. So it doesn't mean that Putin actually has to win a shooting war with NATO to destroy NATO. Putin can effectively destroy NATO and defeat NATO in detail by simply convincing enough policymakers in the capitals of the NATO countries that would have to convene and discuss whether or not to invoke Article 5, convince them it's really not worth getting into a hot shooting war with Russia over a small territorial dispute in a part of a sliver of a Baltic state, especially when the airspace is denied and the Russians have the ability to geographically isolate the Solaki corridor, and it's just really not worth it. That's a scenario that I'm very worried about, because it doesn't require the Russians to go completely toe-to-toe with NATO. And I think Putin has shown that he can outmaneuver the West when it comes to the information space, and defeating the West by convincing the West that it shouldn't make the decisions that it should, because Putin understands if it comes down to a conventional shooting war, NATO wins pretty much all the time, which is why Putin's strategy for success is based on not having that kind of fight, but having a self-imposed defeat in a policymaking fight.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, where we talk about how the ISW collects and analyzes information, or what is the problem with how intelligence agencies operate in the 21st century, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests. And here's what you can see in the bonus part.
They seek to defeat the West. They seek to defeat NATO. It's top secret clearance from the CIA and an analyst who's got top secret clearance from the DIA and an analyst from the top secret clearance from the NSA. From the Russian perspective, let's put ourselves in Putin's shoes. It's actually a major failure of the West to deter a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It tells Putin, I know you're going to do it, and I think you're going to win.